In the winter of 1900, the North Atlantic was not a place for the faint of heart. These waters were brutal, unpredictable, and utterly indifferent to human life. Off the western coast of Scotland, a chain of small rocky islands sat alone in the Grey Sea. They were called the Flannan Isles, remote, windswept, and barely habitable. The only structure standing there was a lighthouse, built to warn passing ships of danger. 3 men were stationed inside that lighthouse to keep the light burning. By December, all 3 of them had simply ceased to exist. No distress signal was ever sent. No body was ever recovered from the water. No note of farewell, no message of panic, no final word of any kind. 3 experienced lighthouse keepers, men who knew these conditions better than anyone, were gone. The lighthouse itself was still standing, undamaged, its lens intact. The lamp had gone dark, but everything else appeared perfectly ordinary. That was precisely what made this case so deeply, enduringly disturbing. The Flannan Isles lighthouse had only been operational for 1 year when the men vanished. It was built by the Northern Lighthouse Board and completed in December 1899. Positioned on Island Moor, the largest of the Flannan Isles, it stood 23 meters tall. Its purpose was simple: to guide ships safely through one of the most treacherous stretches of water in Europe. The rocks surrounding the island had swallowed ships whole for centuries. Now, the lighthouse was meant to be the answer, the warning, the salvation. Instead, it became the location of one of history's most baffling, unsolved disappearances. 3 keepers were assigned to the station at all times, rotating in shifts. The assignment was considered a stable, if isolated, position for working men. Thomas Marshall, Donald MacArthur, and James Ducat were the 3 men on duty in December 1900. Ducat was the principal keeper, experienced, reliable, and calm under pressure. Marshall was his first assistant, known for detailed diary entries and careful observations. MacArthur was a substitute keeper filling in for a colleague on leave. These were not reckless men, they were professionals, and they simply vanished. The supply ship Hesperus was scheduled to reach Flannan Isles on December 26, 1900. It departed from the port of Bracelet on the Isle of Lewis, on the nearest inhabited point. Captain Jim Harvey had made this run before. It was routine, practical, necessary. He carried provisions, mail, and a relief keeper named Joseph Moore to swap with one of the 3 men. As the Hesperus approached the island, Harvey noticed something immediately wrong. No flags had been raised on the lighthouse to signal the ship's expected arrival. On a clear approach, that silence was already the first warning. Harvey attempted to signal the lighthouse with flares and the ship's horn. Nothing came back. No movement, no figures appearing at the lamp gallery, no response of any kind. The island sat as it always did, gray and impassive against the winter sky. Joseph Moore was the first man sent ashore in a small boat to investigate. He climbed the steep stone steps carved into the cliff face, leading up to the lighthouse entrance. The door to the compound was closed but unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside, calling out the names of the 3 men he expected to find. The first thing Joseph Moore noticed was the silence. Not the silence of sleeping men or men at work outside a deeper, total silence. Inside the lighthouse, the fire in the kitchen had gone cold. The clock on the wall had stopped. Dishes had been prepared but never eaten. A chair near the kitchen table had been knocked over and not set upright. Everything suggested the men had left or been taken suddenly, without time to prepare. Moore went back to the ship and returned with additional crew members before going further. Together, the men searched every room of the lighthouse from ground floor to lamp room. Beds had been slept in by 2 of the keepers, Ducat and Marshall. MacArthur's bed, however, had not been slept in at all, though his outdoor gear was hanging by the door. That detail struck the investigators as strange from the very beginning. If the men had gone outside together, why was MacArthur's oilskin coat still inside? In conditions on that island, no experienced keeper would step outside in winter without it. That single coat became one of the most discussed clues in the entire investigation. When the search party reached the lamp room at the top of the lighthouse, the lens was intact. Nothing had been broken. The mechanism that rotated the light was undamaged. The oil reservoirs were full, the light had not gone out due to neglect or shortage. It had simply been allowed to go dark, as though no one remained to tend it. The last log entry made by Thomas Marshall was dated December 15, 1900. 11 days had passed since anyone had written a single word inside that lighthouse. 11 days, and in all that time, not one ship passing had reported seeing the light burning. The log entries leading up to December 15th painted an unsettling picture. Marshall wrote that the storm on December 12th was the worst he had ever witnessed. He described Ducat as very quiet, and MacArthur as weeping, which both were deeply out of character. On December 13th, he wrote that the storm continued and that the men had been praying. On December 14th, he wrote that the storm had ceased and the men were calm again. Then on December 15th, a final entry noting a slight storm, an eerie calm after. After that date, the log ends. The pen was set down and never picked up again. Investigators tried to understand what that final log entry truly meant. Marshall's description of the storm on December 12th was remarkable in its intensity. He used words like phenomenal and seas the like of which I have never seen in 20 years. Yet weather records from surrounding stations showed no severe storm on that date. Ships in the region reported relatively calm seas for mid-December in those waters. Either Marshall was experiencing something the instruments elsewhere could not detect, or something else was happening on that island that had nothing to do with weather at all. That contradiction has never been resolved. The description of weeping and praying is what drew the most attention over the decades. James Ducat was a veteran keeper, a man described by colleagues as exceptionally composed. Donald MacArthur was known for being tough, stoic, even rough around the edges. For Marshall to record both men as emotionally broken by what they were witnessing, that was extraordinary. Something had shaken them to their core in the days before they disappeared. Whether it was the sea, the isolation, a physical threat, or something stranger no one could say. The log stopped before the answer could be written. The investigation shifted to the exterior of the island after the interior yielded no bodies. Investigators found that equipment had been moved or damaged at the western landing stage. Iron railings had been bent or twisted. A significant amount of force would have been required. Heavy ropes and crane equipment that were typically stored far above the waterline had been displaced. It appeared that an extraordinary wave or series of waves had struck that side of the island. The western landing was substantially lower than the eastern side, more exposed to open ocean swells. That discovery gave investigators their first working theory of what might have happened. The official inquiry, led by Robert Muirhead of the Northern Lighthouse Board, concluded in early 1901. His conclusion was that the men had been swept into the sea by a freak wave. The theory suggested two of the men had gone down to secure equipment at the western landing. The third, MacArthur, whose coat remained inside, may have gone to warn or assist them. A sudden rogue wave could have struck all three before any of them could retreat to safety. It was a plausible, practical, and deeply tragic explanation, but not everyone accepted it, and the details left behind continued to resist a clean resolution. The Flannan Isles are not the kind of place where you linger by the water's edge unnecessarily. Every keeper stationed there understood the island's relationship with the sea was violent and unpredictable. Experienced men did not approach the lower landings without good reason, especially in rough conditions. For all three men to be at the water's edge at the same moment, that was the part that didn't sit easily. The protocol was explicit. One keeper always remained inside the lighthouse at all times. That rule was fundamental. It was not a suggestion. It was a standing operational requirement. All three men being outside simultaneously violated the most basic principle of lighthouse keeping. Some investigators pointed to this as the most troubling inconsistency in the official account. If Ducat and Marshall went down to the landing for equipment, MacArthur should have stayed inside. The fact that he apparently did not leaving his coat behind suggested panic, urgency, or compulsion. Something drew all three men out of the lighthouse at the same moment against their training. What that something was has been the subject of speculation for over a century. A desperate situation? A sound or sight that demanded immediate response? Or something else entirely, something the official report was not prepared to consider? In the years following the disappearance, alternative theories began to surface. Some researchers proposed that one of the three men had suffered a mental breakdown. The isolation of a posting like Flannan Isles was known to affect men psychologically over time. The log's descriptions of weeping and unusual silence were cited as possible signs of deterioration. Under this theory, a violent incident between the keepers might have led to tragedy. The evidence, however, was circumstantial: no blood, no signs of physical struggle inside. The lighthouse showed no indication whatsoever of violence or confrontation between the men. A second theory suggested the men had somehow left the island voluntarily on a small boat. Emergency equipment stored at the landing included a small dinghy for short-distance use. If the boat had been deployed and then lost at sea, it would explain the absence of bodies. But investigators found no evidence the dinghy had been used or was missing from its position. Additionally, no boat of that size could survive the North Atlantic in December without a larger vessel nearby. There was no larger vessel. No passing ship reported picking up survivors or seeing a signal. That theory, too, collapsed under the weight of the physical evidence against it. Every piece of physical evidence inside the lighthouse pointed to normalcy interrupted. The supplies were fully stocked. The oil stores were untouched since the last delivery. Food had been prepared in the kitchen, a meal that was never consumed. The beds were made with the exception of the one that had clearly been slept in recently. Nothing was missing from the stores. No tools, no provisions, no clothing except what the men wore. This was not a planned departure. Nothing suggested the men had prepared to leave. Whatever happened to James DeCat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur happened without warning. The case was formally closed by the Northern Lighthouse Board in early 1901. The official verdict, accidental death by wave and sea, was entered into the record. The lighthouse was restaffed and continued to operate for decades afterward. But the case did not close in the minds of those who studied it. Writers, journalists, historians, and paranormal investigators returned to it again and again. Each new generation found something in the details that resisted the official explanation. The three men who vanished from Flannan Isles became symbols of something deeper than a work accident. In the decades that followed, Flannan Isles began to attract a different kind of attention. The remoteness, the unanswered questions, and the eerie details made it fertile ground for folklore. Local fishermen had long regarded the Flannan Isles as an unusual and spiritually charged place. Ancient superstition held that the islands were inhabited by forces that did not welcome human presence. Old Hebridean traditions warned against even naming certain things while on or near the islands. Whether or not one believes in such things, those traditions predated the lighthouse by centuries. The men who vanished were the latest chapter in a much older story the island had been telling. There are accounts from earlier sailors and fishermen who reported strange experiences near the isles. Sightings of lights moving on the uninhabited rocks before the lighthouse was built were documented. Birds behaving in unusual patterns, compass readings that drifted inexplicably, unaccountable sounds. None of these accounts were accepted as scientific evidence by the formal investigation, but they contributed to a body of anecdotal experience that surrounded the islands for generations. When three trained professionals disappeared without a trace in 1900, those older stories were remembered. Some people felt the islands had simply continued doing what they had always done. The North Atlantic in December is a force that defies easy description. Rogue waves scientifically documented now but dismissed in 1900 can exceed 30 meters in height. These waves form suddenly, strike without warning, and vanish as quickly as they appear. A single rogue wave striking the western landing of Island Moore could have killed all three men instantly. The water around those rocks is deep and fast-moving. A body lost, there is a body lost permanently. No amount of searching from a surface vessel in those conditions would recover what the ocean chose to keep. Modern oceanographers consider the rogue wave theory the most physically plausible explanation available. But the ocean does not explain the log entries, and the log entries are the part that lingers. What was Marshall describing when he wrote of a storm more violent than anything in 20 years? What caused two experienced, emotionally stable men to weep and pray in the days before they died? If a rogue wave killed them suddenly on December 15th, why were they already disturbed on December 12th? The emotional deterioration recorded in the log preceded the physical event by 3 days. 3 days of documented fear, silence and prayer, and then silence of a different, permanent kind. That gap between the psychological evidence and the physical theory is where the mystery truly lives. No funeral was ever held for the three men because there were no bodies to bury. Their families received official notification of their deaths by the Northern Lighthouse Board. James Duckett's wife and 4 children were living in Breadalbane at the time of his disappearance. Thomas Marshall came from a family with a long history of maritime service. Donald MacArthur left behind family in the Western Isles who never received an adequate explanation. The formal letters they received spoke of accidents, sea conditions, and unavoidable tragedy. What they were never given was a reason, a genuine, satisfying, human reason. That absence of closure shaped how the case was felt by the communities connected to it. In the fishing villages of the Outer Hebrides, the story was passed down through generations. It became a warning, a ghost story, and a genuine mystery all at once depending on who was telling it. Children grew up hearing the names Duckett, Marshall, and MacArthur spoken in hushed tones. The lighthouse at Flannan Isles became a landmark not of safety but of dread. Sailors who passed it reportedly looked away, or made the sign of the cross, or said nothing at all. The island kept its secret, and the sea kept the men, and the world moved on without answers. In 1912, poet Wilfred Wilson Gibson published a poem about the Flannan Isles disappearance. It brought the case to a wider literary audience and cemented certain details in the public imagination. Gibson added fictional elements: a half-eaten meal, a chair overturned, an untouched meal. Some of those details were real. Others were poetic embellishment that became mistaken for fact. Over the decades, it became difficult to separate what the investigators actually found from what was written. Historical researchers in later years had to return to the original inquiry documents to strip away the mythology. What they found was both more mundane and, in some ways, stranger than the legend had become. The original inquiry report by Robert Muirhead is a model of restrained Victorian bureaucratic language. It lists observations, measurements, and findings without drama or embellishment. It acknowledges the damaged railings, the displaced equipment, the unlit lamp, the final log entries. It reaches its conclusion, death by sea, with the confidence of a practical man seeking a practical answer. What it does not do is explain the psychological content of Marshall's diary in any satisfying way. The report treats those entries as incidental rather than as the most significant evidence of all. A century later, that choice by the original investigator still troubles the historians who read his work. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse was automated in 1971. No keeper has lived there since. The island is now visited only by occasional research teams and seabird survey groups. The lighthouse itself still stands, maintained remotely, its lens still turning through winter nights. Visitors who have landed on Island Moor describe a palpable atmosphere that is difficult to articulate. The rocks, the wind, the absence of any wildlife shelter, it is a place that resists human comfort. People who go there speak of wanting to leave before they expected to, without being able to say precisely why. The island does not explain itself. It never has. And so the case of the 3 Flannan Isles keepers remains exactly where it has always been. Unsolved. Unresolved. A question mark written in cold salt water and Victorian ink. 3 men went to work on a remote Scottish island, and the world simply stopped receiving word from them. No explanation has ever fully satisfied the evidence. No theory has closed every door. The rogue wave is the most likely answer, but likely is not the same as certain. And in the space between likely and certain, the mystery continues to breathe. In the next part of this documentary, we go deeper into what the log entries may truly reveal.